Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible and visible to everyone. I welcome you all on behalf of the English department of our college to the very first online event that we are organizing. I hope you all find something worthwhile to take away from today's program. Now, the introduction of popular fiction in the undergraduate English syllabus in Calcutta University has given us the welcome opportunity of critically discussing texts that we grew up reading with a lot of enjoyment. And for those of us who are engaging this particular course in the classroom, I'm sure it's a common experience to see our students giggling at the antics of Captain Haddock and enjoying the brilliance of Lewis Carroll and Shukumar Ray, and also being intrigued by the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot. So it is with this enjoyment in mind that we have embarked upon our program today. We have an invited lecture um, titled, very interestingly titled, "Poisoned in Jest: The Curious Case of Detective Fiction." Um, the speaker for today is Professor Mousumi Ray from ARSD College of the University of Delhi. So her bio note will follow shortly, so I'll not go into that. But I can tell you that she has been an avid crime fiction enthusiast for the longest time. Now, detective fiction, as we all know, it's at the heart of detective fiction lies a crime, along with many other allied genres like the thriller or the spy novel, the police procedurals. Now, all of them, the crime is there, the detective is there, and then in a way, it explores how human consciousness makes sense of what might otherwise seem to be meaningless experience or random violence. So, in the words of Joanne Dobson, she calls it an extremely moral genre. And she says it's the strongest violation of the moral code that we experience in detective fiction. And as P.D. James, the inimitable P.D. James, reminds us that what the detective story is about is not murder, but the restoration of order. With those words, I would like to invite our bursar and teacher in charge, Dr. Taposh Kumar Paul, to speak a few words on this occasion.
Uh, Good afternoon. Our bursar and teacher in charge, Dr. Taposh Pal is having some network issues. We'll connect to him later. On behalf of the IQAC and on behalf of the college, a very warm welcome to our respected resource person, Ms. Mousumi Ray from the University of Delhi. A warm welcome to all the participants, to my colleagues, and to all the students watching this. In days of isolation and social distancing, webinars have evolved as an excellent as a way for remaining connected, for keeping our minds active, for intellectual stimulation. It is also an opportunity for students in remote areas to listen to the best minds on the subject. Interestingly, this is the first webinar we have been organizing on behalf of our college. The saying that the morning shows the day, we have a line of interesting topics waiting for the next few days and next few weeks. And my humblest regards to the president of our governing body, who has been always supportive of all our endeavors, and also to the members of the governing body who gave us the much needed impetus to begin organizing such academically stimulative lectures. This topic is quite close to my heart. I have loved detective fictions all my childhood. Detective fiction is a type of a popular fiction in which a crime is introduced, it is investigated, and the culprits are revealed. Its beginnings historically can be traced to 19th century Edgar Allan Poe's The Murder in the Room War. The period between the two world wars was called the golden age of detective fiction. When Agatha Christie wrote the best of the novels, she remains one of the most translated authors till date. Uh, it is always the persona of the detective has endeared the readers to the story, and often we see that the triumph of good over evil stands out at the end of all detective fictions. Uh, Once again, my heartiest congratulations to the Department of English. My heartiest congratulations to the Department of English for organizing this webinar, the academic coordinator and the department head, Anupama Monstro, for coming forward and doing this first webinar of our college. And I think we have with us Dr. Taposh Kumar Pal, our bursar and our in charge with us, and I would request him to say a few words.
Taposh, your audio is not connected. We can't hear you.
Audio.
Taposh's audio is muted.
Audio.
No, we can't hear you. Rojini, I think we might as well move on to the speaker introduction.
Okay. I think Professor Taposh Kumar Pal will be back soon. I would request Shubha Jana from the Department of English to kindly introduce the speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Today we are pleased to welcome Professor Mousumi Ray, Assistant Professor of ARSD College. Professor Ray teaches English at ARSD College, University of Delhi. Her foray into college teaching began in 1998 in Sri Shikshatan College under Calcutta University. Her areas of interests are popular literature and films, modernism, and detective fiction. She has publications on these areas of various journals. Her latest work is an essay on Emily Dickinson titled Emily Dickinson, the Poet of Infinite Possibilities, published in Women's Writing, Texts and Critical Essays, a series of critical readings for BA English honor students in Delhi University. Her penchant for tales of crime notwithstanding, she is a recipient of Ambassador of Peace Prize awarded by the Universal Peace Federation. So I request your full attention to Professor Ray and I welcome her to the virtual stage. And if you have any queries regarding this session, please put it into the comment section of YouTube. Over you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shubha. Um, I would like to thank at the very onset GMSM College for their endeavor in trying to make good use of this lockdown that we are going through and trying to engage the students into a kind of an intellectual platform wherein they get to, hopefully, they get to take away something from the webinar today. This, I assume, is your first attempt at a series of webinar. So I wish you all good luck. And I am actually very impressed by the fact that you have decided to conduct a webinar not on Zoom or Meet, because one of the troubles that we keep on having with Zoom and Meet is that people keep on coming in and out, and there are audio and video interruptions and disturbances. So my particular takeaway today would be that in my part of the world, we haven't yet discovered StreamYard. So I'll take it back and I will share it with my colleagues. So thank you very much. I congratulate the IQAC team, the English department team of GMSM College, and your tech support team for undertaking this very innovative and interesting program. So I would like to start with my presentation, if it's okay. I want to begin by trying to share the screen. So please give me a few moments. Can I share the screen?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
you can.
Yeah. Okay. So here it goes. Uh, is it visible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this presentation, my brief was that this is especially going to be for students with the select purpose of sort of addressing their specific examination need, because Calcutta University has recently introduced popular fiction as part of their curriculum. You people are so lucky. When we were doing our graduation, we did not have the good fortune of studying popular fiction. So what I have done in this presentation today is that I have taken from the basic structure of the introduction that I generally provide to my students in class. And this is going to be a broad overview. I am not saying that this is going to be very inclusive or exhaustive. There may be many areas that may get left out, but this is an attempt at a broad classification and a broad overview at the multiple issues and points that need to be kept in mind when we need to factor in the questions and concepts around our discussion of detective fiction. So to that purpose, to make it a little more coherent, I have roughly divided my presentation, and be warned, it's a little longish presentation. Apologies for that, but well, since we seem to have all the time in the world, so why not? So I have roughly divided my presentation into 4 parts, which is, I will begin by defining the genre, talk about the popularity of the genre, talk about the critical viewpoints around the genre, and then wrap it up with the concept of the origin, that where does this genre originate from. And most of you who have paid some attention to the screen would know that I have decided to call it Poisoned in Jest, the curious case of detective fiction. And obviously, many of you would be aware that I have lifted the first part of my discussion, of my title, straight from Hamlet. And though we are not Prince Hamlet, and thankfully not meant to be, curiously, I find that the elements of a lot of these detective procedures are very interestingly prefigured in Hamlet's little play within a play. So the elements of subterfuge, deceit, method, madness, crime, which are an inalienable part of detective fiction, are intriguingly prefigured in Hamlet's play within a play, which he calls the Mousetrap. And what is very curious is that later ages, staring at their own versions of time out of jointness, have interestingly turned time and again to Hamlet to articulate their moment of crisis, to try and understand and interpret their moment of crisis through Hamlet, the play, and the text of the play. So therefore, I also thought that this is a good beginning point. Some of you may think, okay, that I have sort of set wings to my imagination and have sort of kind of read too much into Hamlet. But let me warn you, I am not the only one. A little later in 1993, Derrida, of all people, would be going back to Hamlet when he will be encountering a specific question of time out of jointness in the universe of critical theory. And in his 1993 text, The Spectre of Marx, he will be going back to this concept of time out of joint and the concept of the play that Hamlet works up when he's going to trap the king. Little earlier than that, you have Christie's, the very famous play, The Mousetrap, written in 1952, which is one of the longest running, continuously running plays in English literature. It was only discontinued in March 2020 because of the pandemic situation. So I was making a case for myself, saying that I'm not the only one who's imagining connections. There are others also. So that's a bit of trivia, that's a bit of thought bubble that we can just keep there, out there in the beginning. And let me just cut to the chase. So this, of course, leads us to the primary question, the defining moment, of course, what exactly is detective fiction. Now, ever since detective fiction made its presence felt in the firmament of literature, people have been very excited about this particular genre, and the early theoreticians of the genre, they were very invested in it, and they decided to work upon a definite set of markers to define the genre with a tendency towards exalting the genre. So what they said was that detective fiction has to be considered as a unique literary genre. It has to be distinct from a crime story. And most importantly, it has to present a problem. Now, this is very important because in general parlance, in general perception, we look at the crime component as being very basic and central to detective fiction. However, when we go back to the early theoreticians of the genre, they were actually focusing more on the element of a problem, the method, right? And the method, of course, the crime, of course, was a method or an excuse to set forth the process by which the detective would be embarking on this entire investigative journey. So the problem, again, they were very, very clear cut as to what the problem should be and how one should go about it. So the problem should be solved by an amateur or a professional detective through the processes of deduction. That should contain a clue puzzle element. Again, the element of the game, the element of a riddle, the element of a quest. These are also very central to the so-called problem that detective fiction puts up in front of the reader. Also primary is the intellectual satisfaction of the reader's satisfaction, the problem should be such that it should intellectually challenge the readers and should stimulate the attention of the reader. So the intention of providing an amusement is very central to the genre. Now, keeping in mind these theoretical expectations, the definitions around it, the early definitions around it, also solidified around these necessities that was articulated by the earlier theoreticians. So I have here a catalogue of very prescriptive injunctions rather. So in 1928, you have the Detective Club of Britain, which was made up of writers who imagined that they were going to sit down and write detective fiction. So immediately the Detective Club of Britain, they came up with a series of prescriptive injunctions as to what it should not have. So detective fiction should not depend on divine revelation, should not depend on feminine intuition, should not depend on mumbo jumbo, jiggery pokery, coincidence, or the act of God. So that's quite a list of injunctions. Okay, so it has to be terribly logical, it has to be terribly objective, it has to be terribly rational. W.H. Auden carries these series of prescriptions further, and he says the basic formula is this: a murder occurs, many are suspected, all but one suspect who is the murderer are eliminated, the murderer is arrested or died. So very cut and dried and specific. And please note that he's one of the very first to associate a sense of formula with detective fiction, which is now quite sort of associated with the genre. It has come to become an inalienable part of our understanding of the genre. Howard Haycraft says it very precisely. The crime in a detective fiction is only the means to an end, which is detection. So something that I was clarifying in the earlier slide, that it is detection. So detection is the thing that is of paramount importance in the genre. A crime in detective fiction is an ends to the mean, is a means to the end. And of course, it is the sense of the quest, the sense of the truth that needs to be packaged as a process of detection that is central to crime fiction, to detective fiction. Now, if the theorists were busy laying down rules, departures were also very normal from the very beginning. So while the tendency of the theorist of detective fiction was to always move towards a demarcation of strict boundaries, and you can refer to S.S. Van Dyne's 20 commandments, and he says no self-respecting writer should violate these commandments. But you see, detective writers are potentially very an unruly bunch of people, and detective fiction is a very undisciplined branch. So what they did from the very beginning was that they kept on overstepping the strict generic boundaries, and the writers liberally mixed gothic elements, crime fiction elements, romance, metaphysics, folklore, adventure, to lend the genre a very protean complexity. So they were intermixing these strands very liberally, such that today, in contemporary parlance, critics prefer to locate detective fiction within the broad term of crime fiction. So over the years, you see, detective fiction has mutated to expand from just being a simple whodunit to a foray into engagements of historical, metaphysical, and psychological interrogations. Writers constantly wriggle out of the structural straitjacketing to use crime and detection as an entry point, as a point of baiting the readers into an engagement, and then, of course, launching into attempt at social critique, basically to contest certain interpretative issues that lie at the heart of ideas like identity, the idea of normativity, the idea of truth in contemporary times. Now, this is not really a very late development in the genre. As early as Agatha Christie, and also with reference to the text that you have in your syllabus, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, we will uncover in a bit that this is also an interestingly self-reflexive text. It raises a lot of uncomfortable questions that are out of the well-trodden path that detective fiction is supposed to tread or follow. Writers mostly have chosen to participate in this genre. They have chosen to tell their story in this genre because the genre happens to be immensely popular. If we look at a quick statistical data, we see that since the early 20th century, it has engaged the attention almost immediately. It has engaged the attention of literary critics more than any other genre. Recent figures, as recent as 2019, tell us that about 36% of book sales are under the umbrella term of crime fiction, which is more than any other genre taken separately. And you are also quite aware now of the proliferation of crime series in podcast and Netflix adaptation. So you see, this is a very, very popular genre that we are dealing with. Now, one of the reasons, of course, of the very interesting and quick popularity of the genre is its appeal, is its visuality. Now, it is when detective fiction is born, it arises in a particularly ocular-centric era, the 19th century. The 19th century as an age of technological invention, and it made these technological inventions made it possible to look at our world in visual terms. The modern has about it a sense of an on-screen element. So you see, much of the popularity of the genre is then invested on the figure of the detective. The figure of the detective has a very, very strong screen presence. And those of you who belong to my generation may have grown up looking at the visual representations of Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot, which are imprinted as very strong visual images of Jeremy Brett and David Suchet playing the respective roles. And also the later versions of the hard-boiled private eye is also very, very defining in visual terms. Today's youngsters, of course, identify Holmes with the steampunk version of Robert Downey Jr., or a Benedict Cumberbatch, or a Johnny Lee Miller. And we see that these imaginings are overwhelmingly imagistic, because you see the genre has a grip on the collective consciousness of the public, more so because of its very, very interesting sense of visuality. অনিন্দ চলে গেল জানো। না ওটা আছে মুশকিল। I'll just see. This got disconnected. সব disconnect হয়ে যাচ্ছে। I'm sorry, can you see me? Can you see me?
Mousumi, we can see you and hear you as well.
Okay. So yeah, I'll continue. Huh. I'm sorry, it got a little disconnected. Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah, you are audible, visible.
Okay, and can you see the screen?
No, we cannot see the screen. I think the share screen has gone, but I think you can continue speaking and then you can share the screen.
I'll just check. Just give me. Yes, is this correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. So, right. So we were talking about the visual culture, and we will see that how visuality is a central part. Am I audible? Because I'm getting echoes.
Mousumi, you are audible.
Hello?
Hi, you are audible.
Okay, 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 okay. Uh, because I was getting a little. So I'll continue. I'm very sorry. So we were talking about the visuality, and we realized that visuality is very central to detective fiction because one can say that detective fiction depends on display, the elements of display, and the kaleidoscopic rearrangements of clues and puzzles make the narrative intershot with a visual dimension. And as critic R.W. Knox tells us, that the detective, whatever the detective discovers, should immediately and instantly be produced by inspection for the readers. So a visual dimension is very entrenched and inoculated in the entire genre. An interesting fallout of this tendency, of course, is that the visual dimension extends also to the detectives themselves, because the detectives are etched with defining quirkiness, at times verging on the eccentric, thus making their representations very imagistic. And you will see that how Sidney Paget's desk illustration of Sherlock Holmes have become very, very defining. He gives Sherlock Holmes the deer stalker cap and the Inverness cape, and this becomes a kind of a extension of the character of the detective. One of the things that we see about the character of the detective is that the character of the detective does not grow. It does not grow in the entire series of detective fiction, but that is made up by the overabundance of defining idiosyncrasies that give to that lend a kind of a visuality and a kind of a visual interest in the character of the detective. So it creates a kind of a universe and a sub-universe, this visuality, and that is also one of the reasons why this genre is so popular. Now, when you look at this text that is part of your syllabus, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Chapter 3, this is how Poirot makes a entry. Poirot's entry, of course, is very cinematic. Over the wall to my left, there appeared a face, an egg-shaped head, partially covered with suspiciously black hair, two immense moustaches, and a pair of watchful eyes. It was our mysterious neighbor, Mr. Poirot. So you see, this entire description bristles with iconic possibilities. So this genre is very interestingly a visual genre. Much of its appeal rests in its visuality. The popularity of this genre notwithstanding, there are also vocal detractors of the genre. Prominent among them is Edmund Wilson, who very early in around 1945 declared this genre as subliterary genre, a subliterary type. In his essay, Who Cares Who Killed Roger Ackroyd, it's a very petulant essay, and he does not talk at all of Roger Ackroyd. He talks about how this genre is a genre that is built upon hackneyed plots, elaborate build-ups, and there is letdowns and disappointments. And he compares the fondness of the readers for the genre to opium addiction. Allied with this, of course, is the academia's snobbery of this genre. And because it is a popular genre, because there is a lot of popularity among the masses, this genre is immediately looked upon as being suspicious. by the academia. The academia's intellectual paradigm is divided into, for a long time, was divided into minor literature and canonical literature. Minor literature was supposed to be the popular literature, the popular culture and popular literature, which they held had no part in meaning creation. So that is where they situated detective fiction, and they said that detective fiction is lowbrow and not really something that highbrow definitions should engage with. Allied to that, of course, we have Adorno and Horkheimer and their entire concept of culture industry. So, and I'll do this quickly. Culture industry, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, they compared popular culture to a factory producing standardized goods. Mass culture's power was to evoke conformity, keep consumer response arrested to infantile state, manipulate him or her with false promises of libidinal gratification, and therefore you see these were not things that should be considered in were sort of worth considering in serious discussion. On the other hand of the spectrum, of course, are the diehard fans, the aficionados, who are very intrigued by the trails of mystery and intrigue. And we often see that the brightest minds of any age is under its spell. The writers are also people who have distinguished themselves in other serious fields. Many of them are closet fans. They assume pseudonyms to indulge in their passion of writing crime fiction and detective fiction. Many canonical writers have gone on to borrow the tropes and themes of murder mystery in their own particular serious writings. So a curious phenomenon that emerges, of course, is that if we look at history and the history of the fans of detective fiction, we see that we are in the midst of a very interesting league of people. Reports are that Abraham Lincoln was a great admirer of Poe's stories. Freud loved reading Dorothy Sayers, and surprise of all surprises, there are also reports of Stalin reading detective stories, because communist regimes traditionally are very suspicious of popular forms of literature. So it is very interesting to know that Stalin was also very fond of detective stories. We also know that John Keats, Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot, they were all avowed admirers of popular literature, detective fiction, and even in the haloed portals of academia, like Cecil Day Lewis, he wrote as Nicholas Blake. Dorothy Sayers, she was primarily a scholar of Dante. Then G.I.M. Stewart, he was an Oxford Don who was writing as Michael Innes, and Gour Vidal as Edward Box. They are all famous as writers of detective novels, but they, in their day jobs, they are also scholars, you see. And many of you are quite aware of our recent times when we have J.K. Rowling, who has morphed into a highly successful detective fiction writer. And while doing my reading around this topic, I was so surprised and pleasantly so to find out that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who is otherwise famous for his skyhook and his legendary basketball playing, is also now an acclaimed writer of mystery fiction. He uses the figure of Mycroft Holmes, sets his detective fiction in Trinidad, and talks about detective fiction in terms of the slave trade. So in that sense, he is using the genre to write back to the empire. Now, very quickly, if we look at some of the reasons for the enchantment with this genre, if you are a fan of detective genre, you will flatter yourself, you can flatter yourself and say that the readership is highly intellectual too. So it brings us back to the question of the immense popularity. So we will take a quick look at the various theorizations and the various perspectives that we have around how theories and how theoreticians and critics try to engage with this question of popularity of the genre. Very quickly, because these can get tedious. The first set, which I call Perspectives A, the first set unearth a kind of a mythic appeal, a kind of a folklore appeal to detective fiction, and hold that as being responsible for the popularity of detective fiction. So the first way of looking at it, one of the earliest ways of looking at and explaining the enchantment with detective fiction is the psychoanalytical approach, which looks at detective story as having its origins in the primal scene. The clue puzzle structure are supposed to be substitutes of the infantile curiosity about adult behavior and conversation, and this coupling of crime stories with psychology immediately brings up speculations around its similarity of with the Freudian reading of Oedipal myth. The second, of course, invests it within a folklore kind of a pattern. This reading situates detective fiction within a magical potentiality associated primarily with folklores and heroic romances. According to Jerry Palmer, and I quote, the thriller hero is no more than the medieval knight in shining armor minus chastity plus technology. So you see the theme of the redemptive truth, the redemptive potentiality of truth, truth that is going to set you free from fear is constantly rehearsed in detective fiction, and it reminds us of the folk tales and the heroic romances of the past. So there is a kind of a morality element to it also. The third, of course, is the Christological approach, famously associated with another literary figure, W.H. Auden, in his Guilty Vicarage, the essay in 1948. He defends the genre on the lines of a Christian understanding of sin and the expiation of guilt, the loss of Eden and the consequent recuperation of Eden, and the detective as the deliverer in a secular world. In Perspectives B, if the earlier set of analysis used the themes of redemption and salvation in simple terms, in a secular term, another set of schools look at detective fiction from a political, hegemonic, or structural framework. So again, I'll go through it quickly. You have the ideological analysis of Stephen Knight in his seminal work, The Form and Ideology of Crime Fiction. Major examples of crime fiction not only create an idea or hope or a dream about controlling fiction, but both realize and validated a whole view of the world, one shared by the people who become the central audience to buy, read, and find comfort in a particular variety of crime fiction, which is to say that the sense of reassurance is extracted by the readers from a point of view of shared worldview, which the detective text offers. With reference to Frederick Jameson and his genre analysis, genres are essentially contracts between a reader and between a writer and his readers. They are literary institutions which, like other institutions of social life, are based on tacit agreements or contracts. So the sense of comfort, the sense of expectation, and the sense of gratification is ingrained within the concept of the genre, and that is what feeds into the popularity, because obviously, according to the critics, detective genre is, of course, a very formulaic and a very structured genre. So again, you have Todorov, who talks on the same lines as structure, and he demarcates in his typology of detective fiction, he demarcates popular literature as being separate from high art, because there is a structural conservatism that is associated with reference to the popular genre. And he says that this is very interesting to see that in criminal and detective stories. There are these essentially two stories, and he goes back to Russian formalism, which isolates two parts of the story, the fabula and the sujet. And Todorov says that detective fiction has this tendency of constantly reiterating a purely geometric architecture, and therefore the formulaic nature of the genre is in part it contributes to a large extent to the popularity of the genre. Then we have John Cowelty, who works within the framework of popular and elite dichotomy, and he argues that popular fiction is deeply ideological as formulaic fiction, and that of course works in contrast to mimetic fiction, which is the higher fiction, which is elite and confronts us with disorders of real life. In contrast to the disorders of real life which we see in canonical literature, we have formulaic fiction, which gives us the artistry of escape. And therefore you see these are patterns of familiarity that is brought on by detective fiction, and according to these theorists, contributes to a large extent to the popularity. So what these cluster of writers and critics are, of course, doing is that they all have internalized the critique of detective fiction as a formulaic literature, as a very structured and strict and straight-jacketed form of genre, and they privileged in their theories, they try to privilege this formulaic rigidity, and what they constantly rehearse then is to constantly situate and return detective fiction within an ideological panopticon. This is something that we are going to sort of argue against in my presentation. So moving away now from the theories and speculations, it is time that we track the originary moment of detective fiction. When was it born? Why did it originate? Unlike other genres, we actually can exactly pinpoint the moment when detective fiction was born. Detective fiction is generally taken to have been born in 1841, when Edgar Allan Poe published his The Murders in the Rue Morgue in Graham's magazine, and it was a runaway success. From the very beginning, Poe's tales of ratiocination, as he called it, and his detective Chevalier Dupont have become a kind of a defining template for later versions of detective fictions, which quickly populated the fictive world. The paraphernalia of Poe's ratiocinative tales, like the eccentric detective. Please note that I'm saying eccentric because the detective, very interestingly, is quintessentially most of the time an outsider figure, a misfit in general society, but brilliant and logical. So that has become again a central defining point in detective fiction. Then you have his acolyte, the narrator. Then you have these themes like the least likely person theme, the red herring, the confession extracted by means of mostly psychological pressure. All of these, and the fact that there is a deep power play between the detective and the criminal. And for the detective, it is the instrumentation, the instrument of rationality that reestablishes faith in the Enlightenment project, that becomes very central to the method of the detective. So the sovereignty of the human mind, the fact that one can depend on one's senses as dependable devices of knowledge, all of these are ingrained and installed within the genre. So the detective, of course, functions as a enabling figure in trying to assert the validity of the beliefs that are central to Western civilization, which is the huge dependency on the Enlightenment project of rational thinking. So what the detective fiction does is erect a sort of a comfort zone. So it automatically brings us to the next series of questions. Why was the detective story born? So when we unclasp the detective genre from the stranglehold of theory to recover and recoup the originary impulse behind detective fiction, one very important clue comes to us when we look at Joseph Woodcrutch's statement: Poe invented the detective story that he might not go mad. Now, this is a very interesting cue, and it posits detective fiction within a kind of a decentering, within a kind of a disorder or a disjointed locus. When we look at the sociological landscape and impetus behind the birth of detective fiction, we must realize that Poe was not the only one who was battling his own private demons. The 19th century in Europe and America was an era of accumulating, burgeoning horrors, dis-ease, crisis, precipitated by the official laws of religious assurance stemming from Darwin's theory of the origin of species, which though formally would be published in 1856, but theories around this line of thought was already rife from around the 1830s. Compounding this, of course, was the post-industrialization landscape, which inaugurated an era of giganticism, mechanical processes, which dwarfed the human subject and which dislodged human selfhood from its privileged centrality. So we, in the 19th century, we enter a moment of fragmentation. We enter a moment of disorder, which are brought about by these scientific theories and the growth of industrial processes. One interesting outcome of this was the city, which was the locus for most of the 19th century existence, becomes a sort of a unfamiliar space. The cityscape, which was mostly supposed looked at in a celebratory manner. Say in 1863 we have Baudelaire still celebrating the city as an immense reservoir of electrical energy, not really looking at Wordsworth's injunction that there was this huge influx of people in the city. The cities were in actuality morphing into alien spaces, which was turning the city into a site of the nameless, faceless hordes of people who crowd the city. So the city became associated with huge industrial processes, and also the dethronement, the sort of dethronement and the marginalization of the Western man. And the city became populated by crowd. Friedrich Nietzsche called this the century of the crowd. The crowd is an ambiguous, illegible, faceless entity, and this was becoming the defining feature of the city. It infused a profuse sense of loss of identity and attended anxiety and alienation into the experiential contours of the metropolis. I have this picture slide from a 1913 painting by Ludwig Meidner. It is part of what is called his apocalyptic landscapes, and he painted this with the response, "Let's paint what is close to us, our city world." And this is the expressionistic painting that he paints for us. You look at the slant, the oblique lines. This heightens a sense of the unfamiliar. So this painting captures that sense of defamiliarization, a sense of unhingedness and disorder that was surfacing from the 19th century in the collective psyche of the people. So this is a kind of a pictorial representation of that kind of a defamiliarization, a kind of a subliminal terror that was now getting associated with the once familiar cityscape. If the streets were morphing into dangerous terrains, it was not something that was going unnoticed by the state. The state's response, as evident in 1812 by the setting up of the French Surete, and in the 1829 setting up of the London Metropolitan Police Service, was the primary impulse behind this was the unprecedented growth of population in cities like Paris and London. And before this, of course, there was no organized police force or law maintenance authorities were local volunteers of watchmen. And these people were increasingly becoming very insufficient in controlling the worsening crime rates of the cities. However, the police were not looked upon as very dependable entities. Primarily, one of the reasons was that the French Surete would constantly keep on working with the ex-criminal Vidocq to guide them through the Paris streets and to help them catch the criminals. So, of course, this was something that did not inspire much confidence. On the other hand, the London Metropolitan Police Force was set up with the express intention to protect private property. And this, of course, did not go down well with the common working class, and the police did not inspire confidence in the people as effective mechanisms of law enforcement. So, on one hand, you have the city, which is soon becoming a terrain of that gives rise to terror and fear and anxiety, and the state, of course, is falling very inadequate. Here is a poster that I happened to come across, which tells us that the people, of course, voted overwhelmingly against not allowing police force. The police were looked upon as, this is 19th century England, the police were looked upon as a waste of money. They were looked upon with suspicion by the common folks because the police was constantly being looked upon as being in collusion either with the bourgeois or with the criminal. So you find that the police force did not operate or was not adequate. It is something that has also slipped into detective fiction, because you find that in detective fiction, it is very commonplace that the detective stories have police officers who are mostly the butt of ridicule. They are unable to solve, and they depend on the detectives, and they walk away with the fame and the glory of the detective. So you see this impulse of detective fiction, this kind of a theme that we have constantly reiterated in detective fiction, can actually be traced to a very real moment in the originary profile of the police force. So if the cities and the familiar was being defamiliarized, a new type of threat was emanating, and it was emanating primarily and distinctly from the megalopolitan experience. This led to a desire or a burning need, in fact, to decode criminality, to understand criminality. One of the ways that was provided was by Vidocq himself in his memoirs. He provides a paradigm of trying to understand the mean streets of Paris, but the fact really remains that he himself is a criminal. So you see, in the 19th century, the city dwellers across the continent understood a kind of a dimly felt sense of horror and insecurity, which was increasingly becoming a leitmotif of their urban existence. Danger was not something that could be othered. Danger was not something that was arising from outside, but danger was there within a familiar context, which was increasingly becoming defamiliarized. So the old horror of the city and the old horror of the city mob as a monster, because the people would remember the Parisian mobs during the Parisian Revolution. The old horror and the old anxiety of the mob as a regressive entity was gradually resurfacing. It was at this time, in around 1876, that Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso tried to give, and not tried, rather, he succeeded very well in giving a scientific armature to his theory of the criminals. His concept of criminology was drawn from the concept of social Darwinism, on physiognomy, to posit criminality as an inherited trait. So what happened was that a criminal was now looked upon not as a moral aberration, therefore amenable to reversal, but a criminal was looked upon as a savage, or a sort of an extension of an atavistic tendency in the way that nature works. So what it led was, on one hand, of course, it created the criminal as a monster. It birthed the idea of the fact that nature can, in fact, in itself, self-destruct itself, or go into a regressive mode and uh, uh, and fall back into a subhuman stage. So you see, the idea of deviance, the idea of criminality started getting associated with a subhuman stage. On one hand, and I digress a little, it of course created, it was very helpful in positing criminality to the colonies, because the colonies were looked upon as subhuman and barbarian and uncivilized. But on the other hand, you see, monstrosity was something that was highly possible in a very familiar context as well. So that created a deep sense of dis-ease in the people. And we see that in the murder of the Rue Morgue, even though it is written much before Cesare Lombroso's theorization, the idea of the criminal as being regressive, as going back to a stage that is subhuman, is very, very interestingly prefigured, because in the murders of the Rue Morgue, it is the ape which murders. And again, you see, if you read your text that is there in your syllabus, Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Christie refers to this theory when Dr. Shepard tries to stack up the cards against Ralph Payton. There is a point in the story when he says that Ralph Payton inherits the weakness that his mother has. So what Christie was doing was, she was dipping into this very palpable sense of criminology, which was being sort of pandered to at that point of time, which was being decimated at that point of time. Again, Agatha Christie would later articulate this kind of a danger arising from someone around you when she said that every murderer is almost always someone's good friend. So this constant engagement of threat arising from the familiar is something that really started haunting the urban dweller from the 19th century itself. Now, if we look at the city as a locus of engagement, it is something that is not particular just to the 19th century. The city as a locus of engagement, as a locus associated with urbanization, consumer culture, the bourgeois ascendancy, can be traced as far back as the 17th century. So the quintessentially urban experience of the breathless pace of life, which was in sharp disjunction to earlier historical periods, which were supposed to be continuous, has a history of being acknowledged in the writings of the 17th and 18th century in forms of literary representation of the city. And there was a sense of the looking at the ephemerality of the city experience as chaotic, but illegible carnival. So there was a sense of celebratoriness about looking at the city. You have first the essayists and then this particular breed of intellectual writers, the flaneur, who arose as a kind of intellectual posturing towards interpreting the city and towards consuming the city as a spectacle. Walter Benjamin, Baudelaire, they talk about the flaneur, and the flaneur is a term that comes to describe a class of writers who combined within them the craft of the essayist and the journalist, and who used that craft to watch the crowds in arcades and boulevards and present city sketches to the newspapers. They claim to possess extraordinary powers of interpretation. So you see, the flaneur was posited in late 18th, the 19th century as people who uh, used their observation, their power of observation, and they used the cityscape as a text, and they replaced the moralistic strategies of the essays with a aesthetics of consumerism. So the city, with its ephemerality, was something that was up for consumption, was something that was up for celebration. So you see, the 19th century readers were actually enamored in France, America, England. The 19th century readers were actually enamored of the flaneur's city sketches. Those were journalistic methods of reducing the diverse, unfamiliar, contingent elements of the crowd into an ordered structure. And they were curated in such a way that they delighted the urban spectatorship. So this was a culture, which is not to say that the city was not open to interpretation. It was open to interpretation. There were these intellectual posturings and strategies that was already there since the 17th and the 18th century. However, when Poe introduces his detective in 1841, the city stands reoriented under another set of gaze. This time, the gaze is of crime reporting. So the 19th century was also the age of the trial pamphlets, the criminal biographies, and popular literature by Sue and G.W.M. Reynolds in his Mysteries of London present a picture of the city as cloaked in mystery and potent with threat. Okay, so no longer is the flaneur's interpretative strategy the only defining way of reading the city as a text. If we look at what Amy Srebnick says, she says that by looking at crimes that are out there, you begin to open a window on a culture in a particular time. So if we look at how crime was being read or experienced at a particular time by a particular culture, that opens up a window in understanding the kind of experiential template that was being produced at that point of time. So cheap, sensational journalism of the penny newspapers and the public's ghoulish fascination with violence was seen as can be actually seen as a kind of response, albeit misguided, towards an understanding of the constant brush with danger that the city offered. So the celebratory interpretative format of the flaneur was no longer living up to the expectation of annihilating and addressing the threatening opacity of the city's text. Interestingly, in 1840, a year before he went on to write his detective fiction, Poe wrote The Man of the Crowd. He presents the flaneur's interpretative prowess there as a myth. And the story tracks the figure of a flaneur as he watches the city crowd. He keeps on slotting the city, the people of the city, into familiar brackets until he faces a particularly problematic old man who he thinks is a criminal, but he is unable to actually decode and decipher that man. So this particular essay this particular short story uh, was written by Poe particularly to establish the failure of the flaneurs method to identify a gap in the urban text. So when he uses his own flaneur, he sees that there's a lot of unprocessed data that is floating in the ephemerality of the city, which cannot be decoded or mastered by the gaze of the flaneur. So, with this story, Poe identified a need for a different kind of an urban observer, one who could decode and disable the unlocalized sense of malevolence that was lurking to disrupt the surface calm of the city existence. So, what Poe does in this short story, The Man of the Crowd, is that in trying to, by trying to give us the lacuna in the flaneur's strategy, he returns to the city a phantasmagoria of terror. And to counter that, he creates the figure of the detective. So, the idea of an individual whose task was to identify the source of disorder and solve a crime was a very new idea. In fact, the fictional detective precedes the real life detective. And in 1841, when we have the fictional detective who's trying to restore order and trying to read the threat and thus disable it, the term detective did not even exist in the English, in the Oxford English Dictionary. So you see, what Poe does is that he implants a new version of a interpretative strategy. Therefore, the detective appears as a dialectical improvement of the flaneur. And because the detective is a dialectical improvement of the flaneur, the city, very interestingly, remains and solidifies as central locus of detective fiction. Ever since the Rue Morgue, and I have a quote from there, then we sallied into the streets, arm in arm, continuing the topics of the day, or roaming far and wide until a late hour, seeking amid the wild lights and shadows of the populous city that infinity of mental excitement. Or from Conan Doyle's Study of Scarlet, London, that great cesspool into which all loungers and idlers of the empire were irresistibly drained. So you see, or for that matter, Holmes's London and the Baker Street irregular. So you see, the city becomes a very, very interesting establishing locus in most detective fictions. It takes a break only in the cozy post-war mysteries, and then of course comes back in the mean street mysteries of the hard-boiled detective fiction. So you see, the detective is born as a individual, as an idea of an individual who can crack the code of analyzing the unprocessed data that the city throws up to its reader. So it addresses a way of decoding anxiety and the terrors of city and urban existence. So Poe situates his version of the urban interpreter within the matrix of an urban existential crisis, which is marked by a condition of vulnerability, alienation, and subliminal evil. Unlike the flaneur, who wanted to not broach the subject of anxiety, who participated in a kind of celebration of the ephemerality of the city without really critically analyzing it, the detective thrives on addressing the reader's anxiety. The detective takes the reader's anxiety, plays around with it, increases it to a feverish pitch, and then affects a dramatic resolution. Dana Brown summarizes the method of the detective fiction thus: he exploits the aesthetic appeal of the shock. The structure of the detective story permits the readers to experience both the thrill of epistemological and physical anxiety in the city and the pleasure of its resolution. So what the detective fiction does is that it involves the readers, it makes the readers equal participants within the meaning making processes of the text. In the world of detective fiction, when it was first born, the contemporary world was emptied out of spiritual assurance or of the dependability to folklore heroes. So the detective was erected and installed as a savior figure, almost messianic in stature, turning mystery into meaning. So he stands as a buffer between the world as a strange and dangerous place and the readers. The detective is also a kind of reader, a meta reader, who employs the superiority of human reason to read the compromised text of clues and hints and signs that are authored by the criminal. So, what really happens in a detective story is that there is this overwriting of the text of the criminal by the text that the detective implants. So that, of course, is a very, very interesting game plan that is part of detective fiction. In his narrative process, of course, he is aided by his superior knowledge and dependence on rationality. And you will find that in almost all detective stories, there is this constant referencing to technological innovations and experimentation. That is very central to the genre of detective fiction. The figure of the narrator is very interesting. Again, the figure of the narrator is the go-between, is the reader's representative in the story. He is the narrator is us peddling a kind of a fantasy that if we till the time we don't gain the prowess of the detective, we can be one step removed from the detective, but still within that comfort zone of a fictive world where it is possible to decode threat, to tame and domesticate threat. As P.D. James noted, detective stories help reassure us in the belief that the universe underneath it all is rational. So it tries to rationalize our fears. These are small celebrations of order and reason in an increasingly disordered world. So in a world increasingly going out of joint, this gives us a kind of a comfort and reassurance that if we know the exact method of countering these disorders, we may just be able to survive the threat. So the detective story repeatedly rehearses the story and strategy of psychological adaptation to the challenges and demands of day-to-day living. So it posits human reason as the holy grail of salvation in a non-sacral world. So, in the span of the 2 centuries since we have had the detective figure in our midst, we see that the pattern established by Poe has crystallized into a recognizable formula, especially in the tradition of the golden school of detective fiction. Curiously, however, if we undertake an investigation into the journey of detective fiction, we see that the pleasure principle with which we really identify the genre has morphed into a kind of a Hamletesque jest because detective fiction has overstepped its strict boundaries and it has trespassed into issues of other issues and engagements into sociological issues, historical issues, and social critique, such that even though each detective story begins with a kind of a promise of providing amusement, of providing the thrill of detection, at the heart of this jest is Hamletesque because at the heart of this jest there is a earnest. you will find that when you look at your own text in the syllabus, Roger Ackroyd, and I'll quickly do a little reading of that, you find that when you begin the text, the dedication is to Punki, and that, of course, is Christie's sister, and she says to Punki, who likes an orthodox detective story, murder, inquest, and suspicion falling on everyone in turn. So when she begins this story, there is, of course, she's aware of the fact that there's a set of expectations that are associated with detective fiction. But as we move into the text, we see that she jeopardizes every single predictability about the text. So you have an unreliable narrator who turns out to be, sorry for the spoiler, but who turns out to be the murderer. You have a bunch of characters in the story who are all potential murderers. The victims are not innocent figures. And one of the most important things that actually also disturbed her contemporary readers is that the murder of Roger Ackroyd refuses a kind of an ennobling closure. So a sense of evil is returned into the fabric, into the village of King's Abbot, because for one, Poirot, for whatever reason, refuses to immediately identify Dr. Shepherd. And when we look at the fact that even if Dr. Shepherd is annihilated, we see that the social space of King's Abbot remains a space that is populated by guilt and deceit and trickery. Because if you look at it, every single character in the text is a potential murderer. So what happens is that the text of Roger Ackroyd does not return us to a sense of assurance. In fact, it opens up. Like Hamlet's play, it catches the conscience of the society. It is for this reason, it leaves the readers with a sense of dis-ease. It leaves the readers with a very different set of understanding of criminality, where criminality is not really othered or unpacked, but criminality is posited strictly within the British social leisured circle. So you see, this text is very interesting because this predilection of detective fiction to constantly subvert its own expectation is there from the very beginning. So because the genre was born out of an urge to bandage a time out of joint, each time and age confronts its own particular horror, writers have overwhelmingly opted to participate in the genre. And now you see cultural readings have acknowledged that the writers of detective fiction, what the writers of detective fiction knew from the very beginning, that the text is an autonomous site. It can exist both as a locus of ideology as well as ideological struggles. So you see, detective fiction has constantly subverted itself and has challenged historical ideas of fixities imposed upon it, such that now we have various types of detective fiction: the white glove school, the hard boiled, the police procedurals, the psychological serial killer thrillers, the transgressive themes wherein they question historically unprocessed questions of race, class, identity, gender, post-coloniality, and metaphysical thrillers, apocalyptic thrillers, and counting. So you see, each day we see that detective fiction is reinventing and kind of stretching the possibilities of its own devices. It is curious considering the fact that it was always held as escapist, marginal, and peddling cheap thrills. So I rest my case. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mousumi, for your unraveling, elucidating, demystifying act. I'm sure my students have vastly benefited from this session. And it's not just me saying this, there are a lot of comments that have praised your presentation. And there are a few questions. There are about three or four questions. But before we go into the questions, those of you who have joined us from the beginning would know that our teacher in charge was having a bit of a technical glitch and he was unable to join. So that I was wondering if we could give Moshumi just a breather of a minute and have Dr. Paul speak just for a minute, and then we can come back to the questions. Dr. Paul.
Hello.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Hello.
Yes, you're audible.
Res respected Principal Sir, President Sir, Sri Joydev Haldar, and respected Principal Sir, Dr. Abdullah Jamadar Hassan, in absentia. Honorable Speaker, all respected teachers of Gour, Sachin Mandal Mahavidyalaya and other colleges, and my dear students and other participants. Good afternoon to all. Gour Sachin Mandal Mahavidyalaya is a government-aided college situated at Bireshwarpur near Lokkikantpur in the district of South 24 Parganas. It was established in 1968. The college is situated in a green and clean rural environment. We have two shifts, day and morning shift. 24 subjects are taught here, out of which 14 are of honors course. We have more than 7,000 students. During pandemic of COVID-19 situation, when our college is closed, it is not possible to interact with the students directly. We are trying to motivate the students through online classes, different webinars. We are organizing a series of webinars in different subjects, in different scheduled dates. Almost all the departments have planned to arrange webinars. Today's lecture covers CC6 of English Honours Course, Semester 3. It is a paper on popular fiction. The Honorable Speaker has nicely described the perspectives, consequences, the genre of detective fiction. It will benefit the students and will help them to understand the background and context of the text that they have in their syllabus. I must thank to the faculties of the Department of English and also to an IQAC of the college. On behalf of the college authority, I also express my heartiest gratitude to the resource person Mousumi Rai, Assistant Professor in English, ARSD College under the University of Delhi, for her lucid deliberations. All of us must have enriched from her deliberations. I expect all of your presence in future webinars also. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul. And now, as I said, there were quite a few questions and a lot of comments that are in praise of the presentation. But I'll go directly to the questions. Um, so, Professor Shoma Roy has actually two questions, so I'll take them together. One is, can you please just comment a little on the role of the female detective, Mrs. Marple, Harriet Vane, but also the detective of Sue Grafton's work? That is her first question on female detectives. And the second question is, she says, I'm puzzled by the order disorder concepts. The complexity and ambiguity of the terms are too many. So, you could take these two together.
Okay, so I'll, as Anupama knows that I'm in a bit of a hurry. So
Yeah.
obviously this requires a lot of elaborations, right? So thank you, Shoma, for your question. Quickly, when we look at the role of, and I'll not go into it separately because that
Of
again is
course.
a very, very sort of another sort of area to invest in and should not be done away in 1 or 2 minutes. But when you look at the female detectives, female detectives had made their presence felt quite early in the history of the genre. You have Baroness Oxy, writing about Lady Molly in Scotland Yard. So what actually happens in with reference to female detectives, of course, is that we have here sort of an alternate uh, paradigm of looking at facts and at looking at clues, which is charged by less of physical activity and more with feminine intuition. You will go back if you remember that in the school of detective fiction that was in that club in 1928, which was set up, one of the things that they expressly said was that feminine intuition should not be allowed. So, however, when you have writers, especially female detective writers, they chose to bring to the forefront concepts of feminine intuition, a way of departing from, say, the male, if I may use, male over dependence on the concept of the Enlightenment project and the sovereignty of the Cartesian concept and the sovereignty of human reason. And they decided to domesticate, in a way, the process of detection. So that is how the female detective was, of course, claiming the genre has been used by various writers to write back. So you have writers who address historical silencing. You have writers who address patriarchy. You have writers who write back to the empire. Because the detective fiction is so new, it did not come with its associations of the fact that, okay, women were only supposed to write sentimental novels or religious novels. So women, of course, participated wholeheartedly. They began by installing male um, uh, detectives, but very soon many of them went back to female detectives. And Miss Marple, of course, is Agatha Christie's favorite detective. She was not very fond of Hercule Poirot. And the second question, you are puzzled by the order disorder concept. Now, I don't know whether I am getting it right or not. Order disorder, of course, if you go back to the concept of the Enlightenment process, where you see that there is this paradigm of looking at disorder from the point of view of decipherability based on rational thinking. Okay, and the fact that you can use your senses are adequate to decipher disorder. Then, of course, the fact that in the 19th century, if at one hand you had the sense of ephemerality, the sense of breathlessness in the cityscape, and you had the interpretative strategies of the flaneur trying to put an order and a meaning into that ephemerality, as Poe tells you, and as you see the competing literature about crime posits in front of us, that there was the sense of an anxiety, a sense of a disorder, a sense of a time out of jointedness that the detective figure needed to confront, because the flaneur or the essayist was not sufficient to tap into that sense of a disorder. So that, I guess, was something that I wanted to say. I'm not too sure if you're still clear about it. What is the other?
Actually, there are many more. I was. This is something for the rest of the audience. I know Moshumi. She's my friend, and her daughter has her joint entrance exam tomorrow. So, which is the reason why she's in a bit of a hurry. There are actually quite a number of questions. What I may do is that I probably, if it's okay with you, I will share the questions with you, and you may
Yes,
get back
yes,
to them later. Yeah, because
right.
then she'll be able in a position to get back in a better fashion. I'm very sorry to everyone who's asked because the
There
questions
is
are
Anupama. There is one question that I can see.
okay.
Somebody has asked, what do you mean by the detective being eccentric? So I'll take this as
Yes.
a last question,
All
right?
right. All
So
right.
yeah, yeah. May I?
Yeah, please. Please
Yeah.
go ahead.
So, okay. So, what I meant was that generally, as we were talking about the component of visuality and the visual dimension in detective fiction, and that the fact that a lot of the sense of popularity that comes to detective fiction is centered on the figure of the detective itself, unlike say other genres wherein we look at the plot. The detective has a very interesting and overwhelming screen presence. So many a times, in fact, most of the time, all the detectives are inflected with eccentric idiosyncrasies. That is something that we take for granted. We know about it, right? So you have Holmes and his idiosyncrasies, you have Poirot and his idiosyncrasies, you have Miss Marple. So there are these defining eccentricities, there are these defining idiosyncrasies. Those are there. But I choose to also see that the detective as an eccentric figure, as someone who is the out of center. You see, most of the time, the detectives are also outsiders. You look at Pose Dupont, you look at Hercule Poirot, you look at Miss Marple, or for the benefit of my students, if we look just at Hercule Poirot, you see Agatha Christie goes out of her way to define Poirot as eccentric, even spatially. He is not even British. He belongs to this little country of Belgium. And he is marked by these idiosyncrasies, which of course are not, are something that are laughable. But because he is outside, he is a marginal figure, he gives a very interesting, objective viewpoint about the British society. So, in that sense, the detective becomes very useful in affecting a critique. In later developments of the genre, we see that this opens up spaces for outsiders to operate as detective figures. So, when we are talking about, say, gender, we may have a lesbian detective, right? Or if we are talking about race, Barbara Neely, we have a black slave woman who is a detective. So what happens is that because the detective figure, it is already installed from the very beginning as a eccentric figure, the writers can import stories about unresolved historical silences through the figure of the outsider, the eccentric detective, the detective as the outsider. So you see, we have narratives of the empire. We don't have narratives of slavery. So if the detective as a historian, you see, the detective becomes a historian in many of the later, versions of the genre. The detective as a historian is an investigator into the historically silenced issue. So that is why the concept of the detective as eccentric is very appealing in my view.
Okay.
Is what I yeah.
Thank you very much. And again, my apologies to everyone else who's asked questions. I promised to send the questions across to Professor Ray. And I would now invite Professor Piali Dash of the Department of English to offer the formal vote of thanks. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. So finally, we come to the end of our today's webinar with a vote of thanks. First and foremost, I would like to thank our esteemed speaker, Professor Mousumi Ray, for a brilliant deliberation. She has really mesmerized us with her splendid presentation. So heartfelt thanks to her on behalf of our college. Next, I would like to express thanks and gratitude to our Honorable President, Sri Joydev Haldar. He has always been a great support for us. Our Principal Sir, Dr. A.J. Hassan, has been constantly encouraging us for such programs. So our sincere thanks to him too. We are also thankful to our bursar, Dr. Taposh Kumar Paul, for his continual help and also for being with us today. We thank all our GB members too for their advice and support. Special thanks to our IQAC coordinator, Professor Ronjini Guho. Her untiring efforts have made this webinar ultimately take place. She also owes special thanks also for her technical support. Next, thanks a lot to our head of the department, Professor Anupama Moitro, for the arrangement, and obviously, of course, thanks to my departmental colleagues. My college colleagues are also to be thanked. Last but not the least, thank you all the participants and our dear students for being and bearing with us and making this event a grand success. Thank you.
Thank you, Piyali.
Thank you.
So I guess we can wrap up.
Right, so wrap. Thank you so much
Hopefully,
to everyone else.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for a patient hearing, and thank you, Mousumi, for the brilliant lecture.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
Ranjini. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. So
We
I'll
end the
take your
broadcast.
leave now.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
end the
sure.
broadcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Bye.